everyone. My name is Jessica Stewart, and I'm the Associate Director for Programs at Social Science Matrix. I'm very pleased to welcome you to our panel today on homelessness in the Bay Area housing crisis. I'm just going to take about 5 minutes here at the opening to tell you a little bit about Matrix and our forthcoming events before introducing the panelists and reviewing the format of the panel, as well as some housekeeping guidelines for the event today. And that'll also buy some time for people to trickle in. So thank you all for joining us. For those of you new to Matrix, we are a social science research institute that specializes in the incubation and acceleration of early stage cross-disciplinary research. Today's event is part of our Matrix on Point series, which is driven by our conviction that today's complex problems demand multidisciplinary solutions and that timely, actionable knowledge is a crucial public good. If you haven't already, we encourage you to sign up for our newsletters and to check our events page. We have some very exciting events lined up this fall, including Matrix on Points devoted to the struggle for democracy in Hong Kong, the 2020 pandemic election in the United States, the rise of democratically elected authoritarians around the world, climate migration, and the economic impacts of COVID-19. We're happy to have you join us virtually for today's conversation about homelessness in the Bay Area. And we're extremely grateful to the panelists for agreeing to share with us their perspectives on this extremely important issue, one that cuts to the quick of the deepening economic inequalities in our region. Also, I'm afraid that Thomas Fuller, the San Francisco bureau chief for the New York Times, who was responsible for some very compelling coverage on the Oakland homeless encampments last spring, will not be able to join us today due to unforeseen circumstances. He was assigned to cover the wildfires in the Sierras and does not have adequate internet access to participate today. He sends his regrets. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you very briefly to our panelists, who are all amazing. Margot Kushel is the professor of medicine in the Division of General Internal Medicine at Zuckerberg San Francisco General Hospital and Trauma Center, and the director of the UCSF Center for Vulnerable Populations. Her research focuses on reducing the burden of homelessness on health through examining efforts to prevent and end homelessness and mitigating the efforts of housing instability on healthcare outcomes. Tomiquia Moss is a nationally recognized nonprofit and public sector leader with expertise in housing, public policy, and community development. Ms. Moss is the founder and CEO of All Home, an organization dedicated to finding regional solutions to the homelessness and housing crisis in the Bay Area. From 2014 to 2017, she served under the mayors of both San Francisco and Oakland, most recently as the chief of staff for Oakland's Mayor Libby Schaaf. Christopher Herring is a postdoctoral fellow at the Inequality in America initiative at Harvard University. Herring earned his PhD in sociology at UC Berkeley, and his research focuses on poverty, housing, and homelessness in US cities. He has collaborated on 3 major studies and publications with the National Coalition on Homelessness and the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness. Our moderator today is Carolina Reid, Associate Professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning and the Faculty Research Advisor for the Terner Center for Housing Innovation. Carolina specializes in housing and community development with a specific focus on access to credit, homeownership, and wealth inequality. She has recently published work on the impact of the foreclosure crisis on low-income and minority communities and the role of the Community Reinvestment Act during the subprime crisis, as well as the importance of anti-predatory lending for lending laws for consumer protection. Excuse me. So the format of the event today is as follows. Each panelist will present for between 10 and 15 minutes, and then Professor Reid will moderate a discussion between the panelists, incorporating questions posed by the audience. So very quickly, just some housekeeping reminders. We'll have time for a Q&A in the latter half of the panel. You can find the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom window. Please feel free to submit and type your questions as they come throughout the discussion. You can also upvote other people's questions that you would like to see answered or submit your own. Depending on time constraints, we may not get to all the questions, but we'll do our best. Please make sure to submit questions through the QA function and not the chat window, which should be used for troubleshooting tech. So if you are having any AV trouble and would like assistance troubleshooting, please go ahead and send us a message in that chat window and we'll do our best to support you. Finally, just so you're aware, this session will be recorded and made available on demand following the event. So now, without further ado, I'd like to turn the panel over to Professor Reid.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I can't see all the attendees, but we're really grateful that you've all decided to share some of your afternoon with us today. I couldn't be more thrilled to have this panel and to have the honor of moderating this panel. And I really want to thank Jessica and Social Science Matrix for pulling everybody together. The three people here have probably done more than anybody to help us understand the causes of homelessness in the Bay Area. They are unerring and bold in their willingness to point out the ways that systemic racism have contributed to and exacerbated the crisis. And they are also at the leading edge of coming up with solutions. And so I'm hoping that we have an opportunity today to talk about the whole arc of this. And so with no further ado, I'm going to turn the mic over to Margot, who is going to start us off.
Great, thank you so much, Carolina, and thank you all for joining us today. I want to start with some level setting and just sort of give the big picture. The first questions we're always asked: why is homelessness so bad in the Bay Area? And in this time, I hope to be able to convince you that it's so bad here and everywhere because of three main reasons. The first is the shortage of extremely low-income housing, or housing for the lowest income members of our community, and I'll walk you through that in a moment. Second, income inequality. And third, the ongoing and ever-present effects of structural and systemic racism. I want to first note what I did not say, and I want to say this as a physician who works both clinically and does research. I did not say the words mental health or substance use, and that is perhaps the first take-home message I want to give. Homelessness is not caused by mental health and substance use problems. I want to remind you all that we know how to treat these disabling conditions. Like every condition, we do better with some, worse with others. We don't always get it 100% right, but generally we know how to treat substance use and mental health disabilities, and those are never a reason or an excuse for someone to be homeless. I will say that it is extraordinarily hard to treat those problems while people are homeless, and there is tons of high quality data to prove this point, that many, many people, in fact, the vast majority of people with significant behavioral health disabilities can be and are successfully housed. I think that people make a heuristic error. They walk down the street, the people who are most visible to them are the people who they assume have mental health or substance use problems. They recognize them as homeless, and they assume that it's the cause. But I also think there's sort of another reason why we, as sort of a populace, and why the body politic, why politicians make this error. And that is, the more we blame this problem on highly stigmatized medical conditions, the more it lets us all off the hook of solving the fundamental problems that have brought us to this point. We have an extraordinary shortage of extremely low-income housing in this country. Extremely low-income housing is any housing that is available and affordable to people who make less than 30% of the area median income. So obviously that number changes where you live in the country. The median income in the Bay Area is high, so making less than 30% of that is relatively high to the rest of the country. In California, we are the second worst state in the nation, where we have only 23 units available and affordable for every 100 extremely low-income household, meaning that we only have enough housing that people could potentially rent because it's habitable, that the cost is right, and that it is not occupied by a higher income renter. We only have 23 units for every 100 households that we have. We think this is probably worse in the Bay Area because of the incredibly high cost of housing. And we are the second worst state in the nation. The only state doing worse than us is Nevada, which has 19 units for every 100. In the Bay Area, you may have heard over the last decade or so, we've created 8 or 10 new jobs for every new unit of housing, any type of housing that we've created. And so I'm not sure, where we thought this would get us. We have a huge shortage in all forms of housing up and down the income stream, but particularly in ELI housing. I want to point out that ELI housing is not exactly the same as affordable housing. Affordable housing goes up to housing that is affordable to those making 80 to 100% of the area median income. And most affordable housing that's built, even though we have a huge shortage of that as well, is built to be unaffordable to ELI renters, meaning built for people who make, usually between 50 and 80%, as opposed to 0 to 30%, which is where almost the entire homeless population comes from. Can't talk about homelessness without talking about income inequality. Obviously, this is dramatically related to ELI housing. And I think we've seen our shortage of housing with respect to our income inequality play out really clearly with the COVID pandemic, where we've seen the infection really concentrated in low wage earners who are living in very overcrowded housing. Because before people become homeless, what they do is that they all crowd into housing in order to make rent that is otherwise unaffordable. And we know, and we've seen from many places, that you can't really solve the homelessness problem without solving these problems. And finally, there's no way we can have an honest conversation about homelessness without talking about the ongoing effects of structural racism. Across the country, there is a disproportionate burden of homelessness on people, particularly Black and Indigenous folks. Black folks nationwide are at 3 to 4-fold increased risk of homelessness. And in the Bay Area, it's significantly worse than that. In San Francisco, for example, less than 6% of the population identifies as Black, but 37% of those who are homeless do. In Santa Clara County, it's something like 17% are Black in the homeless population versus less than 2% in the general population. Why is this? Well, it's hard to disconnect the homelessness crisis in the Black population from the ways that, that Black and brown people have been really discriminated against in the housing market. I want to remind everyone that we are still very much living with the downstream effects of redlining and other forms of discrimination, which until relatively recently in our history were perfectly legal, such that Black renters, in particular Black homeowners, were only allowed to live in certain districts because of residential covenants and other reasons why Black householders could not move to certain areas. And the bank simply said if you lived in one of those areas where you were allowed to live if you were Black, you could not get access to a mortgage. So that Black people were basically left out of the post-World War II home ownership, therefore lost the ability to build family wealth and lost having the security of a family home. And we see that ongoing consequence today, where we see huge wealth gaps. A lot of it comes from the housing market between white and Black households. Even though it is now illegal, we see ongoing discrimination in the rental market, so that Black renters wind up paying more than white renters for the same housing, because if they apply for housing, they're less likely to get it. You add to that the discrimination in the criminal justice system, discrimination in education, which is of course closely tied to housing, and discrimination in employment, and it's not a surprise that we have such a huge overrepresentation. Another thing to know is that if you look only within the homeless population, the Black folks who are homeless are healthier than white folks who are homeless, which in some ways doesn't make sense. We know overall Black folks are much sicker in this country because of the ongoing effects of racism. But the truth of the matter is it takes so much less to become homeless if you're Black than if you're white, so that the Black folks who wind up homeless, many of them are homeless merely because of the lack of the family wealth that could have supported them, lower wages, etc. So why is this so bad in the Bay Area? The first reason is obviously our housing market is so unforgiving. We have really difficult problems with income inequality, some of the worst in the country, some of the highest housing costs in the country, and ongoing effects of structural racism. But I also want to remind people that we are not the worst. For instance, New York has a higher point prevalence of homelessness than San Francisco does, but in New York, 95% of people who are homeless are sheltered. Where in the Bay Area, only a third of people who are homeless are sheltered. I want to remind you that shelter doesn't end homelessness. It, as our governor likes to say, it solves sleep, but it does not solve homelessness, but it makes it a whole lot less visible. So we do have one of the worst problems in the country, but the problem isn't, the problem seems worse than it is because other communities have sort of warehoused homeless people in shelters. We have, as you know, very difficult problem creating housing in the Bay Area, lots of difficult zoning laws, It's hard to build here, huge income inequality, all the problems you're probably aware of. I think Nicole Hannah-Jones said it best when she said that the North and the West did not need to rely on Jim Crow laws to keep segregation and to basically keep ongoing discrimination of the Black population. Because in the North and the West, we basically have housing zoning and housing laws to accomplish that for us. We cannot solve homelessness by merely focusing on the people who are homeless and looking at sort of homelessness programs. We really need to get at these underlying structural determinants. So what can we do about it? Homelessness is, at the end of the day, actually very easy to solve if we had the political will to do so, because housing simply solves homelessness. And as I like to say, everyone needs housing that they can afford. Some need it with a lot of services attached as their disability accommodation. Some needs a little and some don't need any. So what do we know about this? We know that ELI housing effectively solves homelessness. You probably are aware that in this country, we do have a system of federal rental assistance through public housing authorities, or what is colloquially called the Section 8 program, or housing choice vouchers, where renters pay 30% of their household income, and they can use the voucher to basically pay the difference between the 30% of their income and market rate. There's a little bit of nuance in there. But in this country, that's not an entitlement, and only 1 in 4 households who qualify for those vouchers get it. In the Bay Area, we have additional problems that even if you have one of those vouchers, they can be hard to use because in tight housing markets, landlords will discriminate against Section 8 housing, people who hold those vouchers. But we've got lots of data that basically giving people housing that they can afford solves the problem. This is perhaps best shown by the Family Option Study, a very large randomized controlled trial of different options for families experiencing homelessness. Alameda County was one of the counties, and it showed pretty clearly that the cheapest and most sustainable way to house families who are homeless was to simply give them a voucher, problem and all. For those, you might ask, well, what about those people I see on the street with severe behavioral problems? Clearly, they can't just be given housing. And I often hear politicians say, it's not like we can just take people with mental health and substance use problems and stick them in housing. I would say not only can you, but you must. There's an intervention called permanent supportive housing, which links subsidized housing to voluntary wraparound services. This has been shown again and again to be highly effective at housing people who are chronically homeless for more than a year, who have disabling conditions like behavioral problems. In fact, I just finished a study that was supposed to be published last week, but has somehow got held up because of COVID, so it's coming out any day, even though the press already went out about it, where Santa Clara County asked us to identify the 400 highest needs, highest risk, highest users of service homeless folks. These are the folks that are in some ways would be the most impossible to house. These are folks who had 10 to 15 psychiatric ER visits, many jail stays, many hospitalization stays in the prior year. We basically randomized people because we had a very small, we had a limitation in the number of units we had, to housing attached to some intensive case management. That means a team led by a master's trained clinician, like a social worker working with a peer case manager and a bachelor's trained case manager. Together, they had about a 1:15 ratio, so 3 of them for 45 people. They found that 86% of the very highest need folks who they offered the service to were housed successfully. And once they were housed, they stayed housed for over 90, well over 90% of their days for the next several years. They found it took about 2 months to get people into housing. It doesn't happen overnight, and people moved an average of 2 times, meaning they would not succeed in their first housing, so they just moved them somewhere else. This is with the very highest risk people. If you're thinking about that in San Francisco, that's maybe the top 500 people in the whole city who are homeless, that we could get 86% of them housed really easily. What about the other 14%? Now you're talking about maybe 50 people in the city of San Francisco. They might need some different interventions that we could talk about, but I think we'd all agree that if there were 50 people left in the city of San Francisco homeless, we would have many different conversations. There are probably less intensive interventions that are successful for most people, short-term subsidies, so giving people something called rapid rehousing, which gives them up to 18 months of a subsidy while you increase their income. Some people might need as little as first and last month's rent and some housing navigation. There was a great project done in Alameda County by the Bay Area Community Services in partnership with Kaiser, where they offered basically short-term subsidies and problem solving for 515 homeless seniors and successfully housed them all. About 15% needed it to be converted to long-term subsidies, but most they were able to get into housing quite permanently by doing things like buying up single-family homes in East Oakland and putting 6 unrelated people in them, each with their own bedroom with a door to lock and a few services. They were able to house this group of people quite easily. Finally, we should talk about prevention. We can't just focus on the people who are on the streets. We need to focus on people who are at risk of becoming homeless. Prevention is actually quite hard to do, and I'm happy to talk about it more later because I think I'm running out of time. So why is this so hard? Why has this been so hard to do? Because we haven't been focusing on the fundamentals. We can't solve this problem by tweaking different homeless service problems. We've got to expand the availability of ELI housing, both by preserving, protecting, and producing new housing and giving adequate operating subsidies to keep it up. We can't focus on individual solutions. If I hear one more conversation about reforming the conservatorship system, I just might scream, and I'm happy in Q&A to talk about why I don't think that's going to get us anywhere where we need to go. And I think that we have not really thought about this as a regional problem, which I think Tomiquia is going to address. We also focus on the wrong actors. This problem is going to be solved or not going to be solved based on how the federal government acts. We need, ultimately, the scale of this problem is such that we can't fix this problem without having the federal government upping their game in providing ongoing rental subsidies as well as support for the development and preservation of extremely low-income housing. The next biggest actor is the state, and probably the least important actor in this are local governments who take all of the blame. I think I have probably gone past my time, so I'm going to stop now, but happy to pick it up later with Q&A. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Margot. I'm going to turn it over to Tomiquia, but just as a reminder to the audience, if you have questions, if Margot's comments spark something, please put them in the question and answer box, and we will get to them after the 3 presentations. Tomiquia, take it away.
Well, thank you so much, and thank you all for joining us this afternoon. You know, I often do conversations like this with Margot, and I'm kind of like, why go on? Why don't we just move to the Q&A section and hear from the audience? So I'm really happy to be with you all this afternoon and just wanting to build a little bit on the foundation setting that Margot set up for us, because, you know, the way I wanted to contextualize this talk, given that we're with the social science matrix, and we're really talking about someone who takes the red pill, right, that really reveals the unpleasant truth of what we're talking about, or taking the blue pill, which is the blissful ignorance that we have had the luxury of living within. I want to just encourage us all to take the red pill. We are at a precipice in our time where we don't have the luxury of not figuring out what the foundational challenges are to actually ending homelessness in the Bay Area. And we can't do that if everyone is taking the blue pill. So I am really excited to sort of talk a little bit about how we all do that together and what roles we have to play with respect to addressing this issue. The first thing I want to say, and I think Margot articulated it well, homelessness is solvable. It's not just about finding someone housing. It is about figuring out how we bring our most vulnerable residents inside and helping them not just subsist in our communities, but to thrive. And frankly, we have not had a system in the Bay Area, or I would go as far as to say in the state, that has really been designed around how do you bring really poor people, formerly homeless people, into the fold, into their communities where they are offering value, where they are offering, they're living out their full potential, and they have the opportunity in our communities to thrive. We don't have those pathways right now. Margot talked a lot about having enough extremely low income housing for people who need it. That is one of the fundamental sort of pillars of this work, but we also don't have ways for really poor people to actually come out of poverty on the economic and social or economic mobility side. So for, you know, our work at All Home was really designed to think about how do we do this both across the Bay Area. So the 9 county Bay areas who are doing incredible work on the ground, trying to support people experiencing homelessness every day. We're doing it all in silos. Our cities are scrambling, trying to figure out what they do. They're trying to work with their counties. They're reaching out to the state. And we have this very fractious system by which we are trying to solve one of the most fundamental social problems of our time. And when I was a practitioner doing this work, working in family homelessness, most recently leading Hamilton families, one of the sort of signals for me that a regional approach was necessary was when we were working to rehouse families throughout their community, and we were looking as far as Sacramento to find affordable housing that family could afford. And that included a subsidy, that included supporting their income goals. And so when we think about regional approaches to homelessness, the first thing we have to think about is the region actually has to operate as one place. We have 101 cities in our region. We have 58 counties, and every single one of those, many of those cities and counties operate independently with respect to trying to solve the homelessness crisis. So one of the charges of our work at All Home is to try to figure out how do we bring stakeholders together to look at best practices, to borrow lessons learned and things that are working, to strategize around resource sharing, to assess what assets need to be brought to the table in order for us to do a much better job across geographies in order to address the homelessness and housing crisis. And it sounds good. I think people will shake their head. I'm at, you know, at a lot of tables where people are like, yes, regionalism, that makes so much sense, that I'd love to do that. And what we know though is that people talk regionally, but they act very locally. And so when land use decisions and zoning changes are held at the local level, and we don't really have a lot of regional, state, or federal governance that forces us to kind of work as a region, that work has to happen in order to actually meet the needs of the people in our communities. Folks are homeless all over the Bay Area. And when you are experiencing homelessness in San Francisco, you get rehoused to Richmond or Antioch or any other place in the region, you want to make sure that you have community connections there, that there are services and jobs and schools and things that everybody needs to live a fulfilled life. And we don't have those connections available to people who are formerly homeless or who have extremely low incomes across the Bay Area. So when you go to Oakland and you are homeless in Oakland and you try to get housing in another community, those systems don't talk to each other. We can't connect you with the health system just because the funding streams that fund your health care in Alameda County doesn't talk to Santa Clara County. It doesn't talk to San Mateo County. So one of our goals as an organization and as really trying to build a movement around this regional collaboration is that we have to figure out how to allow our funding sources to be more flexible, how to allow our partners, the community-based organizations who are doing this work, our government partners, and our private sector partners. That's one of the other things I wanted to talk about in my opening remarks, which is how important it is to have multi-sectorial relationships in this work. No one sector can do it by itself. Government is in fact responsible for trying to scale interventions that work, but when they are pressed for resources, trying to respond to everyone that needs those resources, there simply are not enough. So how do we engage the private sector and philanthropy in our efforts that harnesses innovation and creativity paired with interventions and solutions that work so we can have a much more responsive set of interventions for people who are experiencing homelessness and who are at risk of homelessness. So we find that helping people understand what your assets are as a sector. I often talk to the business sector, business community about this. They're like, how can we, how can we help? What is needed? The first thing is we need our workers to have competitive wages. We need extremely low income workers who make up a significant portion of those who are most at risk of homelessness to actually have competitive employment, to be able to move up in their companies and earn more so that they can actually afford the housing that they're already in. You know, the thing I am often struggling with is the fact that we're trying to solve a math problem where 2 + 2 doesn't equal 4. People are simply unable to afford the rents that we demand in the Bay Area. And then we blame them for being poor and trying to figure out what their, you know, sort of individual vulnerabilities are, when in fact, we haven't actually solved the fundamental math problems of wealth inequality and housing prices. And so I think that there's a relationship there that is necessary if we're going to get to some of those fundamental challenges within our system. The other thing I wanted to highlight, which I think is super important, and you know, Margot spoke of this very eloquently, which is structural racism is sort of undergirding these challenges. And it's not sort of, you know, when you choose to take the red pill, which I think we all will, it's recognizing that it exists. But I think the next step is figuring out what we need to do to dismantle it. You cannot continue to say, my gosh, how are we going to try to solve homelessness when the persistence of African-American folks, indigenous people, brown people are disproportionately impacted by homelessness over and over again, where every indicator that you can think of, folks are not able to take care of themselves. And so I think that when you're seeing the people on the street and you're frustrated with the encampments in your communities and you have compassion and empathy for that, it's hard to kind of step back and understand where did it all go wrong. But it went wrong 400 years ago. And in order for us to understand how those impacts are showing up in our communities today, we have to be okay with that reality and not be afraid to own it and figure out exactly how do we use our power, how do we use our voice, how do we drive political will to really tackle the systemic issues that undergird homelessness in the first place. So maybe I'll leave it there, Carolina, and open it up to Chris, and I'm happy to take questions as they come up.
Thank you. That was terrific. And thank you for folks putting your questions in the Q&A box. We will get to them after the presentations. Please keep adding in. There's already some great questions there. Chris, would you like to go next?
Great, thank you so much. I'm gonna use a few slides today to help me with this presentation. So I'm just gonna switch over here. Can all see this. So thanks so much for setting this up and going over the roots of this problem. What I'm going to talk about now are sort of the consequences of how we deal with homelessness through the arm of the penal state when we're unable to meet the housing needs and social service needs of those who are finding themselves in this situation of poverty and homelessness. And what I'm going to focus on today are the impacts of anti-homeless laws. These are laws that prohibit life-sustaining activities that homeless people have no choice but to undertake in public. So these are laws such as against panhandling, the sit-lie laws that we have in San Francisco, but also in Berkeley, laws against camping and illegal lodging as well. And although I'm going to be talking specifically about San Francisco, these laws have been spreading nationwide and have been growing at the fastest rate in their history over the last 10 years, to such an extent that most cities now have such bans in place, and they're increasing at an ever quicker rate here. So what I'm going to talk about is once these laws are in place, how are they implemented? How are they enforced? And then what consequences on those experiencing poverty. And then I'll conclude looking at some of the policy implications. And as Jessica mentioned, I was a graduate student at UC Berkeley, and this is based off my dissertation research. And what I'll be drawing on are ethnographic observations. These were done both spending time sleeping outside. I spent 57 nights sleeping outside, 96 nights among hundreds of men in shelters during the windows when there were vacancies. As well as 76 nights in daily hotels. And during this time, I was alongside a variety of homeless men and to a lesser extent women, where I really learned and observed through these interactions, specifically many interactions that became overwhelming at times with the criminal justice system. So over 100, 200 observations with the police department involved with those on the streets. However, after this year of spending a lot of time with unhoused folks, I actually was invited to go along with ride-alongs with police officers and get their angle on this as well, which I'll be reporting on, as well as some of these other observations with community organizations and in meetings. During my time, as Jessica mentioned, I worked on 2 community-based surveys with colleagues at SF State and the San Francisco Coalition on Homelessness, where we surveyed 350 unhoused folks about the impacts of criminalization, and more recently 600 folks about their broader needs in San Francisco. And then with one of Carolina's students actually looked at hundreds of thousands of 911 call records and millions of 311 reports that I'll be sharing today. So first, I just want to talk a little bit about the enforcement process in San Francisco, which I'm calling complaint-oriented policing. And so when I was staying on the streets with folks, something that I quickly noticed was, we'd be within an encampment, and most of the interactions we were having with police officers would look like this: police officers arriving early in the morning, knocking on our tents and explaining to us that someone had called with a complaint, that sometimes even naming the complainant of a specific business and asking us to move along. And this was the dominant interaction that we had. It wasn't the sort of police officers on the beat, although this does exist in the Tenderloin, where they're using their own discretion to enforce this, but really driving around in patrol cars and enforcing these laws. And what we're looking at here is a record of 911 dispatches. So when police were actually dispatched to address a homeless complaint. And the numbers on the y-axis are the number of calls each month that were dispatched to police officers starting in 2011 up until April of 2018. And what we see is an incredible rise in the number of dispatches based on complaints. However, during this time, as you see in the red line, is the number of homeless folks that were counted on each in the biannual city point in time count. Now, these numbers are a gross underestimate, and I'm happy to talk about that, but I think they're pretty consistently a gross underestimate. What I want to highlight here and what I saw was that there were a lot of other forces shaping the policing of homelessness here, more than the rise of homelessness, more than a growth of, say, tents or certain behaviors, but rather this was being driven by things like urban development in areas that folks used to be able to, camp without receiving complaints. Gentrification, a different type and demographic of folk moving to the city who were more likely to call the police, and different institutional forces that were increasing the criminalization of homelessness in the city. And so even though in other areas of the Bay where homelessness has increased, we've also seen a number of these other trends that are increasing the role of police in managing homelessness. Here's just a map of a single month in April of all the dispatches regarding homeless complaints. And I want to highlight here that these homeless complaints that I'm looking at from the Department of Emergency Management, these are not all calls that involve homeless folks. For instance, a call like that might involve drug use, that would not be included in this data, or even say, urinating in public space or drinking in public, right? Things that we know that folks without a home have to do more frequently. These are just calls things like having a tent, sitting or sleeping in public, panhandling, etc. And I also want to highlight the role of 311 homeless complaints, because a lot of us in Alameda County and San Francisco, rely on 311, the sort of customer service hotline where we want to, tell our city government about on how, problems with encampments or whatnot, and don't want the police response necessarily. And we think of this as a non-emergency line. However, what I discovered that was in many cases, police were actually dispatched to these calls, but in more cases, they would often send a sanitation crew, right, to clean up the site. And unfortunately, increasingly, police officers are assigned to these sanitation crews. In San Francisco, Mayor Reid increased the number of police responding along with Department of Public Works from 25 to 52 officers doing this every single day in their full-time work. And so there was a tight interconnection here between the sanitization and criminalization of homelessness. And one of the things that folks that I'd be spending time with most feared was the destruction of their property. In fact, they feared the destruction of their property more than arrest. And what I saw happening was that arrests were actually used as a means to dispossess people of their property. So, just to give you one example, this was actually when I was on outreach with the Coalition on Homelessness. I came across a woman who I'd known a number of months. Cindy was in her early 60s, had necrosis in both legs, and was always much slower to pack up her cart than others. Now, as she sat cuffed in the patrol car, I asked the officers about her arrest, pressing them as to why she in particular was being arrested while others were not. And the officer said, look, others are cooperating with us when we ask them to move. We've given her multiple warnings and she's accumulating way too much stuff. When I tried to save her valuables, the officer ordered me not to steal her property. Now, rather than driving Cindy directly to jail, the officers waited nearly 30 minutes until a sanitation truck arrived to take away all her belongings. When I caught up with Cindy the next afternoon, who was in the same clothes she had been arrested in after spending the night sleeping without a tent, she said, quote, I was out of jail in 3 hours and they didn't even charge me. When I asked where I could get my stuff, they told me that's not their responsibility. And this is a practice I saw and heard time and time again. And so I just think a lot of times we see these, are told that the city is, sending these sanitation crews, that they're cleaning up. We don't arrest folks in the Bay Area, which is more progressive than other places, as much. In this case, she was released, very quickly, as most are. But the very move along order, the threat of arrest, become incredibly punitive, as I'll discuss a little more in a minute. The last thing I want to highlight in terms of how this criminalization is carried out is that we've seen a proliferation of business improvement districts in San Francisco. So these are property owners, merchants, and now even residents who within a certain district collect their own taxes to support mainly private security and also street cleaning. And many of those security guards, as you saw in that picture, if you refuse to move, they'll threaten to call the police. And this type of third-party policing is really growing and having many of the same punitive effects of policing, where you're having people to move along. And so here, this is just from one business improvement district in San Francisco, the oldest one in Union Square. And we see this huge rise in their own recording of interactions with their security with unhoused individuals. And this is, not being found on the books as official policing in San Francisco by the SFPD, but is one means of which these laws are having a much broader impact. So I'll just finish going over some findings from a community-based survey we did about the impacts of these laws. And this is what colleagues and I have called a pervasive penality. And these are law enforcement interactions that fall short of arrest, yet still have the impact of deepening poverty and inequality due to their frequent and really all-encompassing impact. So actually this, before I go to the community-based survey, this is from city data of like what happens to these calls. As you can see, there's very little way in arrest, and only 8% result in detention. However, 89% result in a move along order. While this might not seem that punitive, it first of all solves very little of homelessness. Margot talked about the visibility being a main issue of this. Well, of those we asked in the survey, what did you do when you were last asked to move along? 91% remained in public space, and that's because there's very limited indoor spaces to go into. One thing I think is important to highlight here is also the scarcity of shelter. you know, with the exception of like the first week of the month, which is when I stayed in shelter and people have some income to escape the streets and stay in hotels or revisit with family, the shelters are functionally full in San Francisco, as they are in the other Bay Area counties. Waits typically involve 4 to 8 hours waiting in line, and there are restrictions on the amount of belongings you can bring in, pets, partners, a number of aspects. And even police officers now, they've started offering shelter to homeless people before enforcing these laws in some cases, but these are for one-night beds in which you have to give up all your property. It's not a real offer of shelter or services. And so what this results in was widespread criminalization. It's not just infecting a few unhoused individuals, but 70% of those we surveyed had been asked to move along from public space, 70% had been cited, and 22% had received 5 or more citations. We didn't just survey people who were sleeping outside. It matched the point in time count in San Francisco, where about half those we surveyed were largely, primarily staying in shelter. And yet these results affected a large proportion of them. Citations as well, even though they're initially only for $100, say, had horrible impacts on folks. 62% of those we surveyed of what happened to their most recent citation weren't able to resolve it or even address it due to the chaos in their lives and the lack of funds. And this only kept unhoused folks, you know, prevented them from getting out of homelessness, whether that would be through, you know, gaining the resources to get a job, such as keeping their driver's license or avoiding an arrest warrant that would show up on criminal record checks, to actually accessing services and even housing by being kicked off certain housing wait lists and places. I've already talked about the destruction of property, and so I'm going to quickly just want to highlight this one last aspect that it's becoming particularly, I think, important in our COVID situation, which was, you know, on my observations with social workers, the number of times that people had lost medicines, the number of times I'd witnessed people avoiding taking offers of going to the clinic or hospitals because they were afraid of losing their belongings in the meantime. You know, during a situation where we're trying to get people to trust city officials that they can be tested or to do the type of contact tracing that we need, I can imagine it being very difficult and exacerbating this issue with this lack of trust. I'm gonna just, sorry, this was from another presentation I had done. I'm gonna jump quickly to some ways I think we can address the more limited issue of policing here. And this has been especially become more of a top shelf issue with Black Lives Matter, because as both of our other speakers have mentioned, unhoused folks are disproportionately African American and Black due to their discrimination on the housing market. And therefore, this is also another form of racialized policing. And we really need some structural reforms. We've had a number of cases in the courts move forward, but there are constant workarounds. And one of the ways to get around this is passing what the Western Regional Advocacy Project has worked with in a number of states, called the Right to Rest Act, which would basically nullify these anti-homeless laws to prevent them from being enforced in the first place. Other things I'm currently working on with the a community task force in San Francisco is reforming the dispatch so that police officers are not first responders to homeless-related ordinances. In a city, for instance, Eugene, Oregon, they use crisis responders who are actually, you know, trained social workers. And then also ending this practice of sending police escorts with the public street cleaners to disattach the police from addressing a sanitation issue. And so these are some of the structural reforms that we're currently working on, and I look forward to discussing more in the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks to all three of you for those really provocative remarks. Lots of content to go over. We have about 35 minutes for Q&A. So folks, if you want to put things in the Q&A box, we will get there. I'm going to start because I was so upset this weekend. So I was stuck in a traffic jam in my car. And it turned out the reason that there was a traffic jam was because there was a fire in an encampment alongside the freeway. And I was a little bit upset by being stuck in traffic. What I was really upset about was that the radio person who talks about the traffic said there's a fire in a transient community, and the homeless that are living there are their stuff is burning. And that use of the word transient, right? That even in a traffic report, you could have this sort of structural blame for this fire being placed on people, and the indication that their state of homelessness or being unhoused was a transient state, right? That wasn't caused by the fact that it is the housing market, it is the labor market, it is the criminal justice system. And so wanted to get your insights on how do we change these narratives, or what's a better narrative, and how do we shift the public perception that it is not that it's not our collective problem, because it is our collective problem, right? For the folks that are arguing against affordable housing in their community are the same folks that are responsible for us having people on the street. And so would love to get your insights on how do we change this narrative, or is there a stronger narrative, or even just a story that you want to tell that can really help us to shift how we see this problem? Margot, looks like you're raring to go.
I mean, I think there's so much that could be said about this. I often turn to a colleague, Mark Harvath, who writes, who has like a blog and a Twitter account and a YouTube channel called Invisible People. He had a long history of homelessness, and he goes around interviewing people who are homeless and sort of points out that all of these years of research, you know, the type of things that I do, that Chris does, has not changed anyone's minds, and we need sort of a reset. And, you know, he does a lot of work by this sort of on the ground, humanizing people. So, I mean, the first thing is I usually don't accept panel invitations that don't include someone who's homeless on it or has a lived experience of homelessness on it. I don't always get it right, like I'm here today, which is great. I love being with you guys, but I do think it's important that we include people with lived experience on it, because this is their story to tell. I will also say that having spent a lot of time with people experiencing homelessness, and this isn't just true for homelessness, I think it is a symptom of how much that personal narrative has penetrated, that when you talk to most people who've experienced homelessness, people who've experienced anti-Black, you know, racism as a cause of their homelessness, they blame themselves. Like if you ask them why they're homeless, they go back in their story and talk about it, and you listen to their whole story, and I think, oh my God, like you never had a chance. But you've internalized that. So I do think stories of people with lived experience, but I do think with the caution that we need to be honest about the fact that this narrative is sort of profoundly American, to sort of blame the individual for everything. It is in our sort of political fabric, and there are real reasons why we tell the stories. Like, I think we need to be honest with ourselves that there are going to be winners and losers here. That people living in suburbs are not going to have sort of lily white suburbs with large single family home. You know, that may be unsustainable, and it is a hard reality to tell people that you're privileged, you know, that what you see as good schools is really a result of a profoundly broken and sort of racist system. So I think I spend a lot of time talking to the press on background, and trying to get them to turn away from the sort of what I call the poop and needle stories, which sort of have this very titillating, like, oh my God, somebody pooped. And I'm like, you know, I'm a doctor, we talk about poop all the time. Like, it's not, everybody poops. If you don't poop, we get very worried about you. And so it's just, you know, it's kind of a normal human function, but if you don't have a bathroom, it turns out you poop on the street like that. It's as simple as that. So I think actually trying to get the press to spend more time, and I found them to be very willing to do that, to sort of think through what the structural determinants are, because the press still does have a big role to play. I think working with sort of influencers, trying to get politicians to also tell the story, and to try to sort of, you know, Tomiquia and I do a lot of these events, a lot of them. We spend a lot of evenings together doing these events because I think it is important. And maybe I'll share one really powerful anecdote that Tomiquia's heard me tell before about. I was in, one of the things that I do in my free time is go to meetings where they're trying to convince people to accept affordable housing or ELI housing or housing for homeless folks in their community, because it turns out the people who are against it show up to talk, and the people who are sort of quietly for it never, they're like, I've got something else to do. They don't think of it as a thing. And I was at one of these events a year or two ago, and the most amazing thing happened. As there always were, like tons of people in their like matching t-shirts chanting, basically decrying this this intervention, which is building extremely affordable senior housing for formerly homeless seniors in a community. And everyone was saying what they often say is, we're worried about the children. We're worried about our children. And the speakers, me included, were trying to use reason and judgment and, explain this or that. And none of it was working. And there was this one person in the room who had been sort of sitting there quietly, wasn't wearing the matching t-shirt, and finally raised her hand. And she said, my name is so-and-so, and I'm a middle school teacher in this community. And I spend more time with your children than you do. I spend all day with your children. And your children are watching you. They are seeing the tremendous suffering of people around them, and they don't understand it. And they are looking to you to do something about it. So don't tell me you're worried about your children. I'm worried about your children, and I'm worried about what messages we're sending them about what kind of community we are. And then they like handed the microphone back to us, and we were just like, what she said. And so I think in a way it is encouraging people of sort of good faith, the people who are like, yeah, it wouldn't be the end of the world if some poor people moved next door. That would be great if people had a place to live and weren't homeless. Encouraging them to also use their voice in their communities, because she was in their community that clearly those people in the t-shirts knew her because she had been their kid's middle school teacher, and it was so intensely powerful. And so I think one of the things that Tomiquia and I often talk about is like, we're trying to recruit sort of evangelists for, ELI housing and evangelists for siting. And because what we need to do is, I think, to actually have a real movement, it may be getting all of those people who are quietly okay with it to actually show up and use their voice and vouch for it, because I think that they might be able to call in their people better than others. So that's just a few ideas I have.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that always gets me is, and I do a lot of work around affordable housing, is this idea that affordable housing is for people who are outside of our community, right? The vast majority of ELI households are working households. And I think, Tomiquia, to your point, right? Like, until we give them living wages, until we allow them to thrive, right? They are the residents that need affordable housing. So maybe you could speak a little bit more to that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you put the nail on the head. It's sort of like, we want our cake and eat it too, right? Like, we want our abundance of resource and opportunity, and we don't want a homeless problem. We want, and so the sort of stark contrast between the wealth generated in the Bay Area as the 5th largest economy on the planet, and we have some of the most debilitating poverty in the world. Those two things cannot coexist if we don't acknowledge that they are related to each other, and that, in fact, in order for us to try to solve it, we have to all take ownership of what it would actually take to solve it. So I don't think people like the answer. When people are like, so how do we solve this problem? They don't like that we need more housing at all income levels, especially ELI. We need to have an infrastructure where poor people get jobs, and the jobs are, I think the winners and losers piece is really sort of the fundamental crux of equity. Equity actually means that you have to redistribute wealth, opportunity, power, resources in order to ensure that those who have been intentionally left behind through the systems, in fact, that were designed for those to accumulate an overabundance of resource and power and share it comes back to like when you're a kid and they're like, I want my doll. No, you also get to play with, like, it is basic elements of how do we see ourselves in the collective solution. And if we don't constantly point the finger at it's your fault or it's your responsibility, and we see opportunity in a thriving region where everyone can be successful, then I think that's when you start to change those mental maps and models, because otherwise it's super easy to have degrees so far between those who we see in our communities on the streets and those who are living their lives and taking care of business and accessing resource and opportunity. So how do we build the bridges where our collective fate is tied to each other? The Bay Area is not an economic prosperous region when we have more than 35,000 people who are unhoused, full stop. It just isn't. And that is not an economic winner, and it's not a humanitarian winner. So how do we collectively figure out what do we need to do together in order to change those outcomes?
Well, and I was very struck in Chris's presentation and seeing the rise of calls and the rise of complaints, and just in my head mapping that against the widening inequality in San Francisco, right? Widening income inequality, widening racial inequality, and to what extent is that driving people to be like, oh, this is a problem I need you to address because it's hurting my feelings.
Right, exactly. I mean, the role that, you know, the citizens, residents of the city are calling on other residents who are unhoused on the city is the underlying power dynamic of this criminalization, which isn't necessarily recognized as such, which I think needs to be more so. For instance, a lot of those 311 complaints of people requesting a wellness check for somebody, and then having a police officer be sent, who are the ones responding to that wellness check. And I think here's also, when we talk about changing the narrative, I think we need to hold our politicians more accountable to this. And I think there's a problem when, for instance, Ed Lee introduced this 311 mobile app, telling San Franciscans that they can report unhoused folks in need of a wellness check as a way to help homeless folks when, you know, the police officer is being sent. Or we had former Mayor Mark Farrell pass a anti-camping ban when we already had, San Francisco has 24 anti-homeless laws. All the police I was out with at the time already told me 5 other laws that could have done the same thing, right? And yet this was being promoted as a way to get people out of tents and get people into housing, even though this new ordinance only changed the police code, right? And I think that when the politics is a little different in progressive cities versus more conservative ones, which are more retributive. Like when we look back at that anti-camping ban campaign, it was framed in a therapeutic register that tents aren't acceptable and housing is the solution. And a lot of times we hear that from our own mayor that we need tough love, that we need to increase policing because we're investing in all of these services. And we think of it with more services, there's more responsibility, we have more policing. But the honest, you know, truth when you actually talk to folks, which gets back to, you know, Margot's point of the importance of having unhoused folks in speakers bureaus and getting out and speaking, and what I've learned through the ethnography is the lack of services, of journalists covering the shelter shortages, the poor quality in these shelters that make them inappropriate for a large number of people. And my hope is, and we're starting to see it in some of these counties with what I would consider more genuine progressive leadership, who are recognizing a need for not just reforming, but more structural dismantling and defunding of policing, of not just tweaking structural solutions, and calling out some of the politicians who have put up this false narrative of progressive services and the need for more police.
I just wanted to add another point, Carolina, before we go to the next question, which is, as Chris was talking, it reminded me that, you know, homelessness actually looks different in different communities across the Bay Area. And I think one of the things that we've recognized as we do the work across all these counties is that, you know, folks experiencing homelessness in rural communities, young people who are less visible, like families who are living in their cars and don't even identify as homeless. San Francisco, which has had a persistent chronic street homeless challenge for a really long time. And so, you know, when I was the chief of staff in Oakland, we put together an entire housing plan for the city of Oakland in 2015. And homelessness was not one of the top priority areas that the plan focused on. And that was in 2015. So the rapid nature of both how quickly people are falling into homelessness, how for every family I house, 3 more would become homeless. It certainly is how we support folks once they are in this crisis. But there's also something about it's not the same everywhere. And when people conjure a view of what homelessness looks like, they need to understand that 50% of the homeless families that we worked with were employed, that the children, all of the kids in school districts across the region who are experiencing homelessness, they have 2-parent households who are actually doing what society tells them to do with respect to self-sufficiency. So I think we need to be much more flexible in our understanding of how this crisis, presents itself in our communities, such that we can then have more empathy, compassion, and understanding around what the solution set needs to be and who is responsible for delivering those solutions. So I just wanted to add that, because I think people can have one view of what the issue is and miss out on the majority of folk who are as vulnerable as those who are in encampments, but are less seen.
Margot, did you want to jump in too?
I was just gonna say, like, one of my favorite statistics whenever I say it, like the room rats, about among single homeless adults, so those are adults not in families and not homeless youth, about half are 50 or older now. And when we've looked at it, about half of those folks had never once been homeless before the age of 50. They were sort of low-wage workers, doing their own thing, living in poverty, because that's how we treat our low-wage workers, until something got derailed after the age of 50. And they wind up in the encampments. And they are in the encampments, but people see them and sort of intuit like, oh, I don't know what people think who they are, but they were literally the people who were cleaning our houses, who were working in our warehouses. And that's who, if you walk through the encampments, is a huge chunk of who is in those encampments right now.
Well, and I know we've talked before too, the role that the foreclosure crisis played in that, and that many of those households were caught up in these predatory lending practices, lost their homes, and became unhoused through that. And also their extended families became unhoused through that. Right.
It basically derailed whole social networks, because, if you own your house, you can protect a lot of people from homelessness. Whereas if you're a renter, it's much harder to protect others, because you're worried that you're going to be evicted, and bringing in someone who isn't on the lease is a lease violation. And so what we see is this sort of spiraling crisis emanating from the 2008 crisis. It wasn't just that person A got foreclosed on and wound up in the streets. It's that their brother was foreclosed on, and their brother is now living in a rental apartment in Antioch. And they were hanging on to their, living with mom in a rental apartment, and then mom passes, their name isn't on the lease, they're in the street. And in another time, maybe brother would have moved them into their house, but that's not an option. It's this sort of complex web. And I know, Carolina, you and I have talked about worrying about this current crisis, and are we about to make the same mistakes again?
Yeah, and I want to make sure we leave time both to talk a little bit about COVID and to talk about responses. But there's a couple of questions related to data and how we measure who is homeless, whether or not we're capturing people in the place where they became homeless, or are they moving across city borders? And then Chris, I think specifically to you, how do we get data on these different kinds of enforcements? How many people are, how Berkeley, for example, is using its sidewalk ordinance. So I'm going to encourage you to keep answers brief so we have time to get into some others, but if we could just maybe talk a couple minutes about this question of data measurement, how do we understand who is unhoused?
data is really hard. You know, we have these systems, homeless management information systems, where anyone who receives service is supposed to be entered into those. They tend to skew towards the people who are sort of more system involved and leave out a lot of other people. We use it, you know, there's this annual or every other year point in time count where there's sort of visual inspections and then some surveying of people who are homeless. But the truth of the matter is that, you know, most people who are homeless pass through other systems, whether it be hospitals or social service agencies, and mostly they pass through unnoticed because we don't have a good tool to ask them. And I think that that lack of data then lends itself to this sort of myth making and, you know, and things. So it's really sort of geeky stuff, but I think it's really important for us to move forward that we get this right.
Yeah, and as far as data on police enforcement, we found it extremely difficult in San Francisco to get this. I mean, I begin with my observations as an ethnographer, and this raises questions that then I want to answer with broader sets of data if it's available. So it was from my experience of being on the streets and seeing these complaints that led me to ask, well, then what we need to be looking at really is how many of these interactions are occurring, because I realize how much the move along order itself is the punitive point. And that took a long time working with another colleague at UC Berkeley, Garnand, and the Department of Emergency Management to get that data. I mean, I'm happy, I saw the question, if the person's interested in looking at something similar in Berkeley, please feel free to reach out to me. But even things like citation data, in San Francisco, we haven't had reports on it in the last 3 years. It's not transparent. And it's been one of the best methods I found is working with strong advocates. And in San Francisco with the Coalition on Homelessness, working with specific city supervisors, we've been able to get data that we wouldn't have been able to without political operatives. So for example, we had a budget legislative analyst office report. These are requested by city supervisors to look at the cost of criminalization of homelessness in San Francisco. And it was through that they were able to get information from different agencies. In 2015, they found that it was about $21 million a year being spent on policing homelessness alone. That's another narrative too that I think is becoming a prominent now, especially in the wake of Black Lives Matters, of how much we're spending on policing versus, say, social services or alternatives. So a way to change the narrative with different types of data. But yeah, it's difficult, and we should be, again, holding our policymakers accountable for trying to get this.
And just 2 seconds on that, Caroline. I think from our perspective, really trying to get our data systems to talk to each other also has to be a part of the solution. Margot talked about the homelessness management systems. Each county's management system doesn't talk to each other. They don't cross county lines. We know that it has the capacity to do so from a technological perspective. So I think some of this, and there are some folks working on this across the Bay Area, how do we get comfortable beyond the privacy concerns and a variety of other sort of regulatory and legality aspects, but to figure out if we want a common sense system that responds to people no matter where they are in the Bay Area, the data systems have to be able to talk to each other. And I know that you work on this a lot as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes to Margot's earlier point too, right? If we had better data systems, we could also target our interventions better and understand which households really just need housed and which need housing with some more extensive services or supports. Let's talk a little bit about solutions. You know, my mood these days swings up and down and then down and then down and then down with the current political, economic, health environment. But I do think there is promise and an opening for a more progressive politics right now around defunding the police, around really thinking about housing as an entitlement, in terms of thinking about how do we support people in the labor market, reduce discrimination. where do you all see potential? Where do you think, right, if we were going to really invest and hold the Harris-Biden administration accountable, what should we be focused on? What's going to really have the biggest impact on this problem?
I mean, there's a lot of places to start. I think I am heartened is the word, but you know, until this election cycle, I can't remember any of the presidential candidates in a debate even uttering the word housing. And I don't know if you were like
or housing or racism, right?
Or racism for sure. Oh, racism for sure. Racism, housing, or homelessness. And the fact that we now had some candidates, they got like one question on housing in one debate, you know, I mean, props to Julian Castro, who I think, you know, helped sort of, you know, make everyone talk about it. It is at least on the agenda. I think it really depends who wins the election and who wins control of Congress, but there is so much work that could be done. I know someone popped up a question of like, what do you mean? Like what federal things should we do? And I would say, just because we're short of time, I would go to the National Low Income Housing Coalition's webpage and look at their list of policy priorities, because I actually think it's really strong, and you know, they have a strong coalition to do things like, you know, fund the National Housing Trust, to expand vouchers, to expand supports, you know, different mechanisms to support the, you know, building of affordable housing. I do think that the more we focus on this problem as focusing on the problem of homelessness, we're probably not going to get there. We have to sort of back up and focus on the bigger picture things, and then the homelessness will solve itself, is my feeling. I think it's good that politicians talk about it because it's what motivates the public. I think COVID might have provided this other opportunity with, you know, obviously it's a nightmare. I don't want to talk about it as an opportunity, but in the sense that people are now aware of the role that crowded housing has played in transmitting the pandemic, that if we could get politicians like linking that housing crowding to essential workers is completely linked to income inequality and housing affordability. You know, COVID unfortunately is not going to be the last crisis we see sort of with that. You know, there's always been suffering because of that. It's just more out in public now. So I think there is an agenda that has, you know, that advocates have sort of ready to roll if we can get the right people in place and get their attention on it. You know, make sure that this isn't the 15th thing on their agenda, but is actually incredibly important.
Yeah, and I would add, you know, I think that those are key pieces of the federal strategy, that the federal government actually needs to get back in the business of helping to address the housing crisis across this country. And we actually know how to do that. We've done the math, there are the policy proposals already written, but I would kind of take us a little closer to home, which is, you know, David Chu worked on the establishment of the Bay Area Housing and Financing Authority, which is an entity that sits within the Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which allows us to, for the first time, have some regional governance infrastructure about how can we strategize for the production, preservation, and protection of affordable housing and addressing homelessness at the regional level. And so I think that figuring out how to build the muscle for that regional collaboration and strategy development to help jurisdictions actually meet goals when they set them. You know, it's really difficult for communities to do it on their own because of the resource constrained environment. And I think that we get some economies of scale at being able to do that at the regional level. And BAFA is the acronym for that financing authority, but I think there's a lot of promise there to really help us build a pipeline for ELI housing, to look at prevention at the regional scale. How do we actually target homelessness prevention very strategically? And so I'm very hopeful about that as a solution. The other thing I'd say is, you know, this fall, Proposition 16 will be on the ballot, which will repeal 209 in the state of California. And that will give us a lot more tools to really address the specific disparities as they relate to race across housing, homelessness, education, and a variety of other policy areas. And so I really encourage those who are listening to, you know, read carefully. And I know that sometimes the ballot language is confusing, but it not being able to directly apply solutions that we know work to the communities that are most impacted is really a problem. It's a problem because we're never actually going to get to those systemic issues that we've all been talking about if we don't focus on the people who they're happening to. And then the last thing I'd say is listen to the community. The community actually knows how to solve their own problems. We hear them and then we do something different. If we actually provided resources in a way, not just to bring them to the table, but to actually lift up the solutions that they do and employ every day to resolve their housing crises or whatever else is going on, I think we get a lot further in our efforts to address this problem. So this kind of bottom-up organizing strategy, I think, is also a part of what's given me hope.
Thank you. Chris, and maybe you could really sort of maybe also focus a little bit on this sort of defunding the police question and sort of directing that fund to social service budgets, if you think that's the right approach, or is there another approach?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, first to say that we've had over the last 6 months, you know, COVID-19, this resurgence of Black Lives Matter. I say COVID-19 around this policing of homelessness because one of the CDC guidelines that was put out very early on was that cities should not disrupt or move homeless encampments during community spread. Because this would increase the spread of COVID-19 by shifting folks around. We shouldn't be taking their tents because that is actual viral protection, but we also know basic protection from the elements. And it became very clear that this was a threat to folks' health. And I think that, you know, exposing that and showing the public health lens around this criminalization has been one thing that crisis has brought to light. The other being this resurgence of Black Lives Matter. And we've seen a number of cities now talking about defunding the police, particularly in San Francisco. I've been really heartened by Mayor London Breed's strong stance on this. And I really do think that the lowest hanging fruit in this, I don't know how far we'll get into the broader systemic dismantling of policing, but would be with homelessness. Police officers I was out with, they did not like this part of their job. They felt that this was not their job to begin with, most of them. They felt like this was a social worker's job, and many were being rookies assigned to this force. They talked of themselves as like mall cops and maid service for these, rich people who were complaining. So already this is something I think within a lot of police outfits that there's even their own incentive. We also have other models. I saw a question of like, to what extent can social workers resolve this? Well, they can definitely work with people and not undermine the investments that we have set up in terms of keeping people safe with their medicines intact, with their social workers. And again, I'll point to Eugene, Oregon, where they've been able to divert more than 50% of their calls that were going to homeless complaints to social workers and crisis intervention teams. So I think it's a good place to start. And again, it's very much in line with the call for Black Lives Matters, because as all of the panelists mentioned, homelessness is a product of structural racism and therefore the policing of it is as well.
Thank you. And I think for a long time, I have felt like the only way we actually address that 400-year history is through a real affirmative stance, right? And an affirmative stance to mediate those harms and to both acknowledge them, but actually intentionally try and reverse them. And thank you all for very thoughtful comments. I don't know if Jessica is still on the line, but I think we are at time and I don't see any more questions. So perhaps I'll just take off the mute, clap for our amazing panelists. Thank you everybody who joined us. And Jessica, I don't know if you want to close us out.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really, really grateful. I just want to say that you all rescheduled this, that we were supposed to do this last spring in person, and then COVID forced the closure of campus, and I'm so grateful to each of you for lending us your expertise, and to Carolina for doing such an amazing job moderating. And yeah, so just thank you so much. And Margot, I think the next time we do a panel on this, we'll try and center a homeless voice. I take those points really seriously. So thank you for that.
Thank you all. Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much for having us.